another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you. Here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments, send them to am950radio.com. So this week's show is going to be a little bit different because there's just so much that has gone on in the first 10 days of the Trump administration as of today's taping. So I'm taping it on Wednesday. So he's been in office about 10 days, and I mean, there's just so much stuff to go over. So I am going to start the show off by doing the Sixth Amendment. So we'll get that done, and then the rest of the show will basically be reviewing a few topics I talked about last week, and then just going over some of the stuff that's happened and some of the ramifications there. But before I do that, I wanted to ask Brett. Of all the stuff that's happened this week with Trump, what do you think are as far as you're concerned, your top two things that have gone on so far?
I would say, and this is one I was kind of harping on way before the election, is Trump, which he very much said he was going to do before he was elected, which is removing civil service protections for our government workers.
Yeah.
Because I don't know about you, I do not want partisan hacks trying to disperse Medicaid funds, Medicare funds, or trying to be in charge of the VA, or if you're trying to get a passport, do you really want someone that's going to say, well, were you a Trump voter or a Biden voter? Well, if you're a Trump voter, we'll get you your passport right away. If you're a Biden voter, you got to wait 9 months. That's what I'm afraid is going to happen when he replaces all these people. So that was up there as my biggest concern. The other one was cutting government funding for a lot of these grants that are distributed, since that will impact a lot of nonprofits around the country.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about that, well, both of those, but in particular that one about funding. And here's, this is one reason why I'm doing the show. This shows you how politics matters to you, right? Especially those that, were in a panic yesterday about, well, are their funding going to continue and all that sort of stuff. Well, this is why you got to start paying more attention to politics. This was all laid out in Project 2025. Again, I'll talk about that here after the first segment. So, yeah, those are two of the topics that we're going to talk about as well. So, amongst just so many. And I presume we'll keep doing that in the future. So, but first, here we're going to do our civics segment as we typically do. So, we're at the Sixth Amendment now of the Constitution. So this is, again, part of the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, which deals with your rights if you are charged with a crime in the United States. Now, initially, remember I mentioned this before, where these amendments just were applied to the federal government initially because it's the federal Constitution. But over time, the Supreme Court has also now put all of these on state charges too. So the states have to follow these amendments too. So I'm going to be talking about. When I go over some of these things in a little more detail, I'm going to be talking about what it is in Minnesota, like time requirements and some other things, since that's where most criminal cases are in state courts anyway. So, this one in particular, at the very end, we're talking about your rights to a lawyer, and this is one area where I think the Trump administration is going to try and stop giving or stop providing lawyers to some particular people in their, like immigrants, for example, to try and get them out of, the country. So you don't want to bring a lawyer in there to muck stuff up, right? So this is one of those where I have a feeling Trump's going to try and make a move on this one too. So, and the Republicans are not going to care. So I think that one is going to be under some assault at some point during these next 4 years. Hopefully only at least the next 2 years, because, again, the midterms are coming up in 2026, and if the Democrats can win the House and or the Senate, hopefully both of them, but that by doing that they could put a stop to some of this stuff. But these first 2 years are going to be horrible. So here's what the First Amendment says. Again, this is a long one sentence. That the first Congress put together. So it says, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and have the assistance of counsel for his defense. So there's a lot in here, so I'm going to break it down into parts, again, as I've done in some of the previous amendments here. So, first off, this only involves criminal cases. Okay, so you don't get a right to a lawyer in a civil case. Now, a state may give you some rights to a lawyer in some civil cases. So, for example, one that I was involved in was, in some cases, if you are trying to take a kid away from parents, those parents, in Minnesota at least, have a right to a lawyer if they can't afford one. And sometimes in juvenile protection cases, child protection cases, the parents have a right to a lawyer as well if they can't afford one. So there are a few exceptions in civil cases, but the Sixth Amendment deals with criminal cases. Okay? So you have a right to a speedy and public trial. So what this means is you're not supposed to sit in jail a long time before you have a right to have your trial. That's what speedy means. Now, in Minnesota, for cases where you may get a jail term or a prison term, which are misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor, and felony cases, in Minnesota you have 60 days where if you say, you come into court and you plead not guilty, you can ask for a speedy trial. You make it what's called a speedy trial demand, where you're supposed to have your trial within 60 days after you plead not guilty. Now, if you're charged with a petty misdemeanor, which is the least serious, since you can't go to jail, you don't have a speedy trial for that in Minnesota. But you do for misdemeanors, gross misdemeanors, and felonies. So the defendant in Minnesota can ask for a speedy trial. So can the prosecutor. I did that numerous times when I was prosecuting. And in Minnesota, the victim of the crime can also ask for a speedy trial, which is, you don't see that in a lot of states, but Minnesota is one of them where the victim now can ask for a speedy trial too. Now, oftentimes this is waived by the defendant. That's the one that, typically is the one that asks for it. So if they have a lawyer, their lawyer oftentimes will waive their right to a speedy trial. Prosecutors oftentimes don't want speedy trials. But sometimes they do, and they can ask for it. But, of course, one of the reasons for this is waiving the speedy trial is, imagine if everybody who was charged with a misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor, or felony in Minnesota came to court and pled not guilty and said, I want my trial in 60 days, right? Imagine how backed up the court system is going to get. So, you got to kind of pick and choose which, as a prosecutor, I had to pick and choose which ones I wanted to make speedy trial demands on, because the court system just would get so backed up. They already, there already are kind of judge shortages here with all that, in our court system, but, waiving not demanding a speedy trial helps with this. You also get a public trial, so anybody can come in and watch a criminal trial as long as it is for adults. So in Minnesota, you don't get to go watch a juvenile criminal trial. Now, there is one exception to that. There's exceptions to all of these amendments, right? If a juvenile is charged as an adult, let's say there's a 17-year-old commits murder, those are public trials because they're charged as an adult. But if it's a typical juvenile criminal case, you can't go watch those because they're juvenile cases. Similarly, if you want to go watch a civil trial, you can go watch civil trials. If that's what you want to do. Those are public. Now, part of the amendment talks about, where is the trial supposed to happen? Well, it says where basically it says where the crime is committed. So whatever in Minnesota, it's like whatever county you're in when you commit the crime. Like that's where you're going to have your trial. So in most counties there's a courthouse, and that's where you go have your trial. Sometimes you're if you make a speedy trial demand and things like that, sometimes you go to like the next county over if you have to. But ordinarily it's in the county where you commit the crime is where you have your trial. And that's where the jurors are picked from as well. So, for example, if I assault somebody in Lake of the Woods County, way up by Canada there, that's where the trial happens. There is a big exception that doesn't happen all. Can move the trial. The judge can, because there's so much pretrial publicity, that there's a question whether the judge will change venue. So the judge will issue an order saying, he can't get a fair trial here. I'm moving the trial to a different county where he can get a fair trial because there isn't as much publicity. So that's one of the exceptions. So you will occasionally see those in like murder cases where there's a lot of publicity, or the victim was some famous person in the community and everybody knows about it, or some teacher at the school that lots of people know, that kind of thing. They may move it to a different county. But ordinarily, your trial is where the county where the crime was committed. Next is your right to being told what crimes you're charged with. So when you go to court, if you go to court, if a police officer gives you a ticket, let's say you get a speeding ticket, and they write down speeding, and that's you're told what you're charged with right on the ticket. Now, for more serious offenses, the prosecutor will write up a written complaint. I used to do those all the time, and charge somebody with crimes, and it lays out in the complaint what the charges are specifically and what statutes you violated, that kind of stuff. So that's basically what that part of the Sixth Amendment is. You're told what specific crimes you are charged with. Either you get a ticket from the police or you get a written complaint by the prosecutor. If you are charged with federal crimes, typically those are written indictments that you get. So when you come to court, the judge tells you the charges that you're charged with, or if you have a lawyer, sometimes a lawyer will just waive it. They'll come in and say, we waive the reading of the charges. That's what they're talking about. So when you have a trial, the next part of the amendment is you have a right to sit and watch all the witnesses testify against you that are on the witness stand. You get to sit through your entire trial. You get to see the jurors being picked, right? All the witnesses. You get to see all the arguments the lawyers make, all that stuff. You get to sit and watch your trial. Back when this amendment was being laid out, when the British were doing trials, oftentimes you didn't get to see people. You didn't even get to go to your own trials sometimes. So that's why it's in here. Now, there are some exceptions to watching some witnesses. One of the main ones is if you are charged with criminal sexual conduct with a young child being the victim, the court will sometimes let the child victim testify by video. So that child is not in the actual courtroom. So that exists as one of the exceptions. But ordinarily, you get to watch everybody who's testifying against you. And then the last part is your right to a lawyer. So initially, this meant, you could pay for your own lawyer, right? But over time, the Supreme Court has, ruled often over this issue, and over time they have made it easier to get a public lawyer, or a public defender, they're called. So now, what the current ruling has been by the Supreme Court is if your potential penalty is going to jail or prison, it's like a county jail or the state prison, which in Minnesota is a misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor, or a felony. You can potentially get a public defender, assuming that you qualify financially. So you get to fill out a form laying out what your financial situation is. Somebody screens that and sees if you qualify. Now, I actually did that when I was in law school, when I was working in the Ramsey County court system. That was part of one of the jobs that I did. So in Minnesota, now you have to pay. It's not totally free. Okay, you got to pay $75 to help defer the cost of the public defender, which is paid by Minnesota taxpayers. That's part of the budget, the court budget that we have, right? So you got to pay $75. Now the judge can waive it if you're really poor, or he can reduce it, or sometimes the judge will increase it if your situation changed by the time your case is over. So part of your sentence, if you're convicted, is paying the $75. If you're not convicted, you still got to pay the $75, and the judge will order you to pay that once your case is over. Now you can pay it sooner if you want. No, your right to a lawyer is not absolute. Right? Remember all those people down in Gitmo when after 9/11, Bush threw a bunch of suspected terrorists down there. Well, in the Patriot Act, it denied lawyers for suspected terrorists. So, oftentimes when you hear the government saying, "Well, not a security issue," there are some laws that deny lawyers to people. So, I think you might see Trump doing that with immigration. Now, the act itself of coming over the border without documentation is not a criminal charge. That's actually a civil offense. But if the immigrants commit crimes while they're here, or violate the law in other ways, they have a right to lawyers too. So I suspect you might see Trump try to get rid of those in the immigration lawyers that try and help these people in their detention hearings. So you're going to see people be put in these private prison detention camps. How long are they going to sit there before they're deported? How long are they going to sit there before they have a hearing? Will they even get to see a lawyer? I don't think so if Trump gets his way here. But we're going to see this when cases start rolling in, and then we'll have to see what the Supreme Court does. All right, so that's it for the Sixth Amendment. So as we go to break, next week I'll probably do more than just the Seventh Amendment, because that one's pretty simple. So we'll probably do multiple amendments next week. And then when we come back, we'll start talking about all these things that happened in the first 10 days of the Trump administration. We'll see you then.
In my youth, I do recall those were the best times, most of all.
All right, welcome back to another segment here on Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Love me some Led Zeppelin entry music, too, by the way, Brett.
Yeah, always a solid choice. Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So here we go. Trump 2.0, right? Well, this is, the crap's hitting the fan, as they say. And this was totally predicted, right? I went through part of Project 2025. I'll talk about that during part of these segments. This is they laid it all out here in writing. So a lot of people going around going, well, I didn't know I was voting for this. Well, if you paid attention, you would. If you listened to this podcast or the show on Sunday at 5 o'clock, you would know, because we talked about some of this stuff. So Project 2025 is taking shape. The Trump militia is taking shape, as I mentioned last week. We now have a drunk as the Secretary of Defense. J.D. Vance came in and cast the tie-breaking votes, and now Pete Hegseth, who has no experience whatsoever being our Secretary of Defense. Good luck to us all. We're now the laughingstock of the world, especially after all the lies and all the threats Trump uttered at the World Economics Forum. Not to mention his war on immigrants and his war on trans people that is already starting with some of his executive orders. So I'd just like to say thanks a lot to my fellow Americans especially the 120 million eligible voters that couldn't be bothered to save our democracy. Thanks a lot. Hope you're all having a happy first 10 days. Can't wait to see what happens this next 10 days. How about those egg prices and gas prices? They're going up. Who didn't predict that? Oh boy. Well, hopefully enough of you Trump voters will be affected by what's going on, and we'll show you how stupid it is that vote was, and how stupid it is to just vote for Republicans in general, because they're not going to be trying to help you at all. Hopefully you'll see that as we go along through the show, kind of explaining some of how these things are going to start affecting you. So you got to get involved more in politics if you want some control over your life. All right, so first I'm going to start off with a couple of updates from our last show. So first one is, still no response from Pete Stauber or any of the 4 Republican House members that I could find, at least, and I looked around for them, about, what they feel about, the pardoning of all those J6 offenders and all the people that assaulted the cops. Hey, Star Tribune, why don't you go out and ask them these questions? No, you won't. Why no coverage? Well, because it makes the Republicans look bad, of course. We can't have that. And as I keep saying, remember that the media, around 90% of it, is owned and operated by about 6 corporations. They are all in the bag with the Republican Party. They all give them money. They all gave Trump money. They're not going to come out with coverage that blasts Trump. You're just not going to see it. And they're not going to ask Republicans what they think. So if Biden had done something like this, if Biden ran out and pardoned a bunch of people who assaulted cops, boy, the press, they would have a microphone in front of everybody, all the Democrats. Crickets here when it's the Republican side of it, right? This just shows you how the double standard is, as I've said on previous shows. And boy, did they get all worked up when Biden pardoned his son, Hunter Biden. Oh boy. The point here is Stauber was a cop. And his silence here just means that he and the other 3 Republicans agree with the pardons of around 600 people who assaulted cops. Now, not surprisingly, some of these people have committed new crimes and have been charged with crimes. And there's one that was actually shot and killed by the cops already. And I suspect you'll see more of these from these people. So, Stauber's had plenty of energy to blame wokeness, right? To blame immigrants, to blame transgender people, and DEI, and the Democrats for everything that he thinks is wrong in society. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, I forgot. Socialists and Marxists, too. That's what Trump is saying on all these executive orders, right? But Stauber just can't muster the energy to even question these cop assaulters being pardoned. Nice leadership there, Petey. So another update from last week's show is I had mentioned the birthright citizenship executive order, where Trump basically said, I'm changing the Constitution and I am going to make the 14th Amendment, or we're not going to have birthright citizenship anymore. Well, as I said, there's going to be there's going to be lawsuits filed, and there was. And, not surprisingly, a federal judge in the state of Washington, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan, by the way, so this guy's been around, he's a Republican, temporarily stopped the executive order for 14 days. And he, issued a temporary injunction, not letting it go into play here. So Washington was one of the states that sued under this, so that's why the case is there. A number of the Democratic-run states filed lawsuits, so Washington was one of them. And the thing about this particular case, the judge actually said he's never seen such a blatant, violation of the Constitution by what Trump's trying to do here. So the judge ordered a hearing, where both sides will be able to, make their arguments and may or may not, depending on what the judge does, let, some people testify at the hearings. And then the judge is going to make a decision. And hopefully he'll just follow, this and say, well, I'm going to continue the injunction because this just is not legal. And, he even mentioned what I did last week about, the Republicans' whole argument here is the not subject to the jurisdiction thereof, part of the 14th Amendment there when it talks about birthright citizenship right at the beginning in Section 1. And the judge said, well, does that mean, immigrants can just do whatever they want when they come here? Like, can they go out, run around, and commit all kinds of crimes, and we can't charge them? No, of course not. They're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and to the state that they live in. So I suspect that this judge will, or even another judge in Washington will uphold blocking this, and then Trump will appeal it to the Court of Appeals there and the Federal District Court of Appeals out there, who will probably uphold the injunction, and then Trump will appeal it to the Supreme Court, and who knows what will happen up at the Supreme Court because we talked about that already. It wouldn't surprise me at all if the Supreme Court just decided they'll make stuff up and say, yeah, that sounds good to us. We're not going to follow precedent again. We're not going to follow what's in the Constitution again. Right? So, but that's where that particular case stands. Now, speaking of the lawsuits, this involves one of the executive orders that Brett mentioned earlier, where basically all federal funding of all federal financial assistance programs was halted yesterday. And, it wasn't even supposed to take effect until 5 o'clock yesterday. Again, this is Tuesday I'm talking about. But a lot of the governmental, electronic portals were stopped, were blocked. Like you couldn't get into Medicaid yesterday. So, they were shutting stuff down even before the deadline. So, not surprisingly, there was lawsuits filed. A judge, because the judge had to act so quickly because this was, the deadline was 5 o'clock yesterday. The judge issued a temporary injunction until Monday afternoon, and then that particular judge is going to look at it again, and, now that he's got more time, and make another ruling at that point. And there's been a lot of blowback on the Trump administration. So if you watched any part of the press conference yesterday with the new press secretary, who was just like all the old ones Trump had, she didn't even know what was covered and what wasn't. And she came out and said, well, this doesn't cover Medicare, this doesn't cover Social Security, this doesn't cover student loans, and this doesn't cover an individual getting financial assistance from the federal government, whatever that means. Part of the problem here is that whoever is writing up these executive orders is doing a horrible job. Now, I don't know if lawyers are actually doing this or if it's just, Trump lackeys. But they should get lawyers looking at this stuff, because even me, some little old lawyer here in Minnesota can see, some of the problems with this stuff. So this is just another poorly written executive order. But the executive order itself says all federal funding of all federal financial assistance. Doesn't have any exceptions for Social Security, Medicare, individuals getting financial assistance. So, let's let's get ready for this. This is going to keep going. This was what happened during Trump's first term. What comes out of on these EOs is not very detailed, and people are wondering what the heck's going to go on. And it's going to make his press secretary look dumber than they already are. So. By the way, Minnesota is one of the states who sued here, so they're part of the lawsuit. Now, Trump's big problem here is that this, looking at, withholding all this funding, includes money that has already been approved by Congress and has already been signed into law by President Biden. We're not talking about new stuff Trump and the Republicans have just done, because they haven't done any of that yet. This is stuff that's already been approved by Congress, already signed by Biden. It's already a law, and here's Trump trying to get around the law. No surprise there. So the federal law is being violated. I think Trump's going to lose this one too. But, all he's hoping for is some Trump judge that, that he appointed will see it a different way. Or he's counting on this, the Supreme Court to do it. Now, this just goes to show you these people are just in over their heads. But, this is part of their playbook, just chaos, right? That's what they're planning on doing. Well, they've done pretty well these first 10 days as far as the chaos goes. But this was all laid out in part of Project 2025. Right? We covered some of this, hundreds of pages worth of a report. Lots of people didn't read it. Lots of people don't know what's in there. I mean, I covered part of these because there's just so much. This is just right out of the document. It's all part of the plan. So he's going to keep doing these executive orders, or I call them EOs for short. One thing to watch is, are people going to complain like they did yesterday? Like there was massive people complaining, and they were calling their people's members of Congress and all this. Are they going to keep doing it, or is it going to, are they going to just stop now? Trump is counting on people stopping now. You got to keep the pressure up. Not just the Democrats, but people. The people, I think, are going to have more power than the Democrats in trying to do something about and reining in what Trump's trying to do here. Because the Democrats can't do anything in Congress. I mean, the Republicans have control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency. They have the trifecta. They got the votes to back all this stuff up. Unless you can convince a couple House members to vote against things, but Democrats can't really do anything. I mean, they can go, they can go out and complain and, say stop doing this and, all that, but they don't have the power to stop it. Other than helping out with these lawsuits that these states are going to continue doing. So this is, people are getting a taste of what's in store for them. And this includes MAGA voters, by the way. It's not just Democrats or liberals. These MAGA voters, they love the chaos. That's part of their, emotional reasons why they're in with MAGA, right? They love that stuff, but until it affects them directly, they're not going to care. And there's even some MAGA voters, even if it affects them directly, they're not going to care. They just like it. Take it to the libs, right? That's what they live for. Part of what's going on here is that Trump wants to take federal money away from us and give it to the rich as a way to pay for the tax cut that's coming, and it's coming. This is all part of the plan. Again, if you're paying attention with what's going on politically, this is all out there. This is nothing secret. So another one happened involving the Department of Justice. This is one that I spent one of my segments on one of my shows going over this. And part of it was, this is what Trump is going to do. He's going to fire a bunch of the lawyers in the Department of Justice that helped out Jack Smith, all right, and went against Trump. Well, he's done it now through one of his executive orders. This is part of his retribution, right? During his campaign, I am your retribution, he kept saying. Well, this is part of it. Now, I think Trump's going to run into problems here, too, because I'm guessing at this point, but I'm pretty sure that these lawyers have some civil service protection where you just can't fire them for no reason. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lawsuit filed over this, too, because you just can't fire civil service workers. These lawyers are career prosecutors in the Department of Justice. They're not special people just brought in to help Jack Smith. So they have some civil service protection under federal law, and I suspect there'll be a lawsuit filed here, and, again, we'll have to see what the courts do. So we're going to take our second break here, and when we come back, we'll just continue on with this stuff. So the first one I'll cover is firing of the Inspector Generals. So we'll see you then. Back to the third and final segment of the Politics Matter, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Again, if you have any comments or questions about Trump 2.0 or any of these things that he's doing, send them to am950radio.com. So I talked about some of the stuff that Trump's doing in these first 10 days, and we're going to just keep going on with these things. So I mentioned last time he's firing, I think it's like 12-ish or so lawyers from the Department of Justice. And by the way, that's just the beginning. As Brett mentioned at the beginning, this firing civil service workers, if they succeed with that, it's going to be more than just 12 in the Department of Justice. So speaking of firings, right, Trump, through an executive order again, fired... At least the last number I saw was 17 inspector generals. Now, why is he doing this? Okay. So, because he wants to replace them with his own, loyalists, his own cronies. By the way, some of those 17 people he appointed in his first term. They're still there, but he's getting rid of them. Now, you may be wondering, well, what is an inspector general? Like, why are they a big deal? Well, because these are people who oversee the various independent, federal agencies, and they are independent people. Like, they're not beholden to the president or to the Congress, right? They look into allegations of waste, fraud, and abuse in these various federal agencies. And by the way, Trump's always, and the Republicans are always claiming that, there's waste, fraud, and abuse everywhere. Well, that's what the job of the Inspector General is to look at. Well, now he's getting rid of all of them. I think pretty much all of them. Because he wants to replace it with his own cronies, and then they're gonna start going after the immigrants and the transgender and the DEI and all this stuff, right? This is what they're gonna do. Now there's gonna be some lawsuits coming here too. Because federal law says you need to give Congress at least 30 days notice before you fire any inspector general. And you also need to give a rationale for why you're firing them. You have to give like just cause. You have to give them, Congress reasons for why you're firing them, because these are people appointed by Congress, right? And there's a federal law that says you got to do this, President, before you can do, what Trump's doing here. So Trump didn't do any of this stuff, right? He just fired him. So he's going to get sued, and he's going to go to court, and, I suspect, hopefully, depending on what judge it's in front of, they're going to say, yeah, Trump, you didn't do this. Right. No, so Trump may go back and say, well, okay, here's the reasons, and then, wait 30 days and fire him again. Right? Which he probably could do at that point, assuming there's, this rationale, is a good one. I suspect it won't be, and then that might end up in court again, But you have Republicans already, Republicans like Lindsey Graham are out there going, yeah, this was a technical violation, but so what? Yeah, who cares if you violate the law, Lindsey? Trump's going to just keep doing this. And you're just going to keep cheerleading him, right? And all the rest of the Republicans are like Pete Stauber and Fishbach and the other two Republicans. So the Republicans aren't going to do any pushback here. They're just going to let Trump do whatever the hell he wants, right? So this is an example, I think, of how our checks and balances system that we went through earlier in the Constitution doesn't work very well. And now, why am I saying this? Well, because as the Republicans have now shown us, and they did this the first 2 years of Trump's term, his first term. When they control the House, the Senate, and the presidency, they just let Trump or the president do whatever he wants. Right? They're going to pass all the laws the Republicans want. They're going to defy any subpoenas, that might get served on him. They're just going to let him do whatever he wants, including violating any laws that he wants. So this is an example of how Congress is just like giving away its power to the presidency over time. And this particular Republican Congress is just going to keep doing this. They're going to let him do whatever he wants. Who cares about following the law? So if Congress is in the bag for the president, then you got to rely on the court system. And as I've said before, I don't think we can rely on the court system either, because during Trump's first term, there were a lot of wacko judges, and yes, I mean wacko judges who don't know much about the law, got appointed by him. And of course, we have 63 Republican majority on the Supreme Court, which, gave him, out of thin air, presidential immunity for being charged with crimes for official acts during his presidency. So they have already showed that they're in the bag for Trump too. So, if the Supreme Court, because that's where, all these cases are going to head, because Trump, he just appeals. That's all he does, hoping that the other side will just quit. Right? So he's hoping that the Supreme Court will rule for him eventually. And the Supreme Court has, they've done it before for him. Plus, they don't care about precedent. They reversed, Roe versus Wade, so 50 years of rights are gone for women trying to get abortions. They got rid of the Chevron doctrine, which also was about a 50-year precedent where the courts are generally supposed to defer to these government agencies when it's stuff involving their expertise. They're not doing that anymore. Now judges who don't know anything are going to be deciding this stuff. So you can't count on the Supreme Court doing much against him. Hopefully I'm wrong. I mean, this is one of these occasions where I really hope I'm wrong here, but I'm not counting on it. Now, before you get to the Supreme Court, I think there's going to be some judges that are saying, "Yeah, what are you doing? You can't be doing this. You're, breaking the laws and stuff pretty clearly." So, yeah. So, speaking of chaos, let's shift our focus to the state of Minnesota. Right, there's chaos going on right now. Like, what about the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate? So, I'm just going to talk a little bit about that here. So, the Minnesota Supreme Court came out and ruled that a quorum in the House of Representatives means 68 people. So they went by the seats, which is what the Democrats, were arguing. Like, you go by the number of seats. You don't go by the number of people who show up that day in the House of Representatives. You go by the number of seats. So in our House, you need 68. The Republicans have 67. They do not have a quorum. This is why the Democrats are not showing up. At least they're not showing up, yet. I'll get to that here in a second. But the Republicans, while the case was going on, they said they were in charge and they appointed DeMuth as the Speaker of the House, and they had community hearings and all this other stuff. Well, nope, that's not working now. All that's gone and done with by the Supreme Court decision. Again, this was the Minnesota Supreme Court, because this is a state case. This is not the federal Supreme Court doing this. So the Democrats have 66 people until the special election for the remaining seat, where the initial Democrat who won, as it turns out, didn't live in the district. So the judge threw out that election. Tim Walz ordered in a special election. This Minnesota Supreme Court said, nah, that's too soon. You can't do it because there's a law that says you have to wait 22 days after the first day of the session. So he didn't wait the 22 days. So He's come out and said, well, then the special election is probably not going to be until March. Probably, my guess is probably early March, but in March probably, at least. So one of the issues here is, well, how long are the Democrats going to stay out? Because only one of them needs to show up to have a quorum. Now, there's some negotiations probably going on about some sort of power sharing agreement because they need one for 2 years. 67, which is, it'll end up being, you need a power sharing agreement. Right? So one of the issues going on here with this power sharing agreement is the Republicans, let's say 68 people show up, let's say there's some sort of an agreement. The Democrats better have an agreement in there that the Republicans agree not to try and unseat Brad Tapke. Because if they don't seat him, then the Republicans will have at least the majority. Now, again, they won't have a quorum. But, they're banking on the Democrats not sitting out the whole 2 years till the next election, right? So, I've been hearing some people complaining about the Republicans staying out here like this. Well, I'm not one of them complaining. Especially after the Republican stunt that they pulled. We're in charge, and we're appointing all this. They should have waited until the decision by the Minnesota Supreme Court. But I have a feeling they knew they were going to lose that, which they did. So they just did this stunt. Now, some people in the media are criticizing the Democrats here and like, well, why are you shutting down the House of Representatives? Well, the Tapke seat is one reason why. Plus, you got to have a good power sharing agreement in here. The first one that I think the Democrats proposed was not all that great. But I'm glad that they're sitting out at least here for a while because I think the Democrats need to show the base of the party that they are willing to fight. Too often the Democrats don't fight. And by fight, I don't mean writing a strongly worded memo or stuff like that. Like they actually, fight. This is one way they're doing it. And I think most Democrats in Minnesota, at least right now, are fine with this. Some people in the media are like, well, they're going to blame Democrats for this. Or some Democrats might feel that way. Well, sure, some will. But if you don't fight, your base is going to abandon you. Just like I think part of the base of the Democratic Party didn't vote for Harris. Because you just don't fight. So if you get a power sharing agreement, make sure Tapke's seat is part of it. Don't give up too much. You got the Senate now. After, the special election, the Democrat won that one quite easily by 91. He got 91% of the vote. That's what I call a mandate. Not a tie vote in the House like the Republicans are running around saying. So remember, if you want some control over your life, you need to be interested in and participate in politics. This is why politics matters to everybody. We'll talk to you next week.